Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming, and thank you to Penn for honoring me twice, once by giving me the Abraham Lincoln podium, which, if anything, would encourage one to abuse. I can't think of a more solid temptation than that. And the other is to be asked to speak in the name of Arthur Miller, and on the tropes with which those of us in the writing business will always identify him. I don't consider myself supremely qualified to talk, certainly not in his name, but I can say that I knew him a little, that my wife and I were married by the same rabbi, the late Robert Goldberg, who married Arthur Miller to Marilyn Monroe. The same rabbi, in fact, who also was his character witness at the same time at the House Un-American Activities Committee, because it wasn't enough that Arthur was trying to get married to the woman considered the most beautiful in the world. He was at the time having to ask questions about whether or not he counted as an American at all. And I can't not tell you just a couple of things about him and Marilyn. I just can't, so I will. I can't not, so I will. When she was first introduced to the Miller family, Robert Goldberg, by the way, to the end of his life, resisted all efforts to buy from him her conversion certificate to Judaism, a subject to which she was fairly new when she met the Miller family. And Mr. and Mrs. Miller Sr. used to feed her, thinking she needed a bit of, fattening up. And it often would begin with matzo ball soup. In fact, it would invariably begin that way, until the evening when she asked if they ever ate any other part of the matzah. Contrary to the slightly hoydenish reputation that Ms. Monroe has had ever since, has clung to her ever since, she was actually rather demure and rather modest, shy girl. And the bathroom in the Miller house was a bit too near the living room. So out of shyness, I suppose you could say, pudeur, as the French would put it, she used to, when she retired there, turn on all the taps very loudly, just out of discretion, You want to not depress the in-laws. And after she'd gone, and Arthur turned to his mother and said, well, what did you think? His mother's opinion was very important to him. Mrs. Miller Sr. said, well, she's a very nice girl, but she sure pisses like a racehorse. Well, okay, I had to do that, but it's not strictly to the purpose. Somebody told me this evening that it was possible that attendance was down at today's events because of an attempted atrocity in Times Square last night. And if that was true, I would both be depressed and I would take it as an opportunity to underline what I wanted to talk about in the case of Mr. Miller and in the topic I picked, which was Crucibles present and past, which is to say the contagion of fear. As the United States found out in the 1950s, it's incredibly easy, it's depressingly easy, shall one say, to get people who are the children of a revolution, who are born into a country that is governed by a constitution, with all the rights and privileges of a free society. It's very, very easy to get people to give that up, or to devalue it, or to panic and abandon the values of that constitution, in particular of its amendments, its wonderful amendments that constitute the Bill of Rights. And the reason why Arthur Miller was so important to us, and remains important, I think, to people who don't remember any of it, is that he was one of the very few Americans who would say, no, I'm not going to go along with this, and made out of it a famous play recalling an earlier time before the founding of the Republic, before the proclamation and promulgation of the Constitution, when there was an era of witch hunting, which is another way of saying clerical or religious panic, persecution, tyranny, and hysteria, and to see under what conditions we who look down on the poor old primitive uneducated settlers of the Bay Colony, on what conditions we're entitled to do that. What gives us the right to condescend to people if we aren't sure in our own minds that we would be able, in the same conditions, to resist. I think it's a fair bet that anyone who takes the trouble to buy a ticket to a Penn event has played this game in their head at some point in their life. How would I shape up? What would I do when the neighbors were being shipped onto the trains? Or maybe when, because that so often comes when it's too late, you think maybe I should have done something before they started putting them on the trains. When should I have started? Would it have been with the censorship? Would it have been with the racism? Would it have been with the off-the-record imprisonments and executions? At what point? I feel sure I would have taken a stand at some point. I would have been brave. We all have had to do this, and we've all had to look at societies contemporary to ours and in the past and asked, well, okay, what when the Fugitive Slave Act is still on the books and has been extended to the states of the North as well? What about it when the slave catchers cross over into Pennsylvania and come as far as New York, and there's a bounty out, and there's a lot of pressure to obey the law? Of course I'm going to shelter this wanted guy in my house, aren't I? Everyone thinks that they would. Everyone has it's a pleasurable imagination until you begin to doubt yourself, until you begin to think, I wonder if I would be that good. There's a wonderful poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay. It's called Conscientious Objector. I can't quote it all, but it begins, it's just come back to me, but it begins, I shall die, but that is all that I shall do for death. I owe him nothing. He's mounting up in the yard today. His horse, his hooves are clattering. He has business in Cuba, but I will not give him a leg up. I will not tell him where the black boy lies in the swamp. I shall die, but that is all that I shall do for death. Well, this is a hard test for people to pass. And by the time I'd got to know Arthur Miller, he was, of course, quite old, but he'd continued to witness throughout his life, for many decades. I remember when I was at The Nation magazine publishing an extraordinary article, or helping to publish, a very humorous account he gave of going to a dinner at the American Embassy in Turkey at the head of a PEN delegation, which included himself and Harold Pinter, and how Harold Pinter had given the American ambassador to Turkey an absolutely ruinous time throughout the dinner, all night, because of Turkey's treatment of its Kurdish minority. And I had my differences with Harold Pinter, and in fact I'd had my differences with that same American ambassador, and I could almost feel sorry for Ambassador Strauss-Hoope at having to face Miller and Pinter for an evening, knowing that American policy was complicit in a near genocidal policy in southeastern Anatolia. And you know, you could have let that go. You could have said, we're here on a delegation of writers, it's nice of the ambassador to have a dinner, we can sit this one out. No, you can't. No, this is your chance. You'll always be sorry later if you kept quiet. There's never a good occasion for keeping your mouth shut. So far nothing but praise for Arthur from me. But there came a time when a good friend of mine and a great friend of the cause of writing and of free expression and of writers and people who were willing to sacrifice free expression, Salman Rushdie, was hit, as you all remember, by the clerical dictator of the theocratic dictator of a foreign state with a fatwa, that's the way the word entered our language, that condemned him, Salman, to both a life sentence and a death sentence. It condemned him to death, and it enjoined all Muslims in the world to bring it about, which meant that Salman had to alter his social life and other arrangements quite radically for a bit. And, well, I remember thinking on that day, which was the 14th of February, 1989, well, for me, for my lot, for us, this is the case. This is the test. We often wondered, what would it be in our generation? Most free speech cases, you'll find if you look into them, from the trial of Socrates onwards, have been to do with blasphemy. Socrates, Galileo, Spinoza, you can fill in blanks for yourself. Almost always that someone is accused to have gone too far this time and to have outraged the sensibilities of the community as well as the laws and codes of the state and the city and profaned the gods, which you really can't have, because then where would we be? How would we know how to behave if it wasn't for a celestial dictatorship? We wouldn't know right from wrong without that. So it's a really subversive thing to be doing. I thought, well, that's pretty easy. But we should do better perhaps than just get the usual suspects to sign the usual free speech petition. Maybe we should all say, since the fatwa explicitly applies to all those responsible for publication of the book, a missing codicil is often not mentioned, we should all sign a petition saying we consider ourselves co-responsible, on the model of Spartacus or the Danish volunteers in the Nazi occupation who said, if the Jews are made to wear a yellow star, we'll wear one too, and they can't get us all. So I thought it was a good idea, just to up the ante a bit. And then Susan Sontag, to whom I also would like to dedicate any value to you that these remarks may possess, and to her memory, who was that year's president of PEN, fortunately, it came the horrible news that a lot of people were strangely reluctant to sign. That the fear factor, the feeling that the Ayatollah Khomeini's arm could reach that far, that death squads were on the prowl, that anyone who got too closely identified with this might themselves become the object of a hit, was actually keeping away some people from the meeting we planned to have to read from Salman's book and keeping their names off the list. They said, no, I don't want to sign. And I tell this story in my upcoming memoir. I don't want to say anything at all to undermine the memory of Arthur, but there was a crisis with him. And he said, you know what, you probably don't need me. After all, I'm Jewish. It would only attract attention. It would change the subject. It's amazing how persuasive fear can be. You can always think of a good reason. I'll behave better next time. Maybe this isn't such a crux after all. And I remember thinking, this really is for me a moral and intellectual and personal crisis, because if the author of The Crucible has decided that this is an appointment he's reluctant to keep, then we're all in very grave trouble. But of course, the story has a happy ending, and Arthur came through very well, as did a number of other people who'd hesitated. But I'll never forget that week and what I learned about how fragile, how tenuous the commitment of the society to its basic values often is, and how easy it is to panic people into betraying them. And I'll stay with this trope, if you don't mind, because I think it's back, and I think the rot is spreading. And I think it began this present phase about exactly 5 years ago, when a small newspaper in the Jutland area of Denmark, called Jyllands-Posten, published some, you'll know about this, some cartoons, better to say caricatures actually, of the figure of the Prophet Muhammad, who it's wrongly thought cannot ever be represented in art. There are several Islamic representations of him, particularly in Persian culture, oddly enough. It's not a prohibition that is of any great value or of any great force, though it's believed to be by people who like to find cultural reasons, as they often do, for political cowardice and moral cowardice. At any rate, you know the sequel. There was an organized attempt to destroy the Danish economy by boycott, coordinated by some very extreme mullahs in Denmark with some partners of theirs in other countries. There was an open season on Danish people, many of whom were attacked in other countries. By the end of it, we think at least 300 people were killed, and not all of them Danish, in different countries. There were riots between Muslims and Christians in Nigeria, in countries where demonstrations are never normally allowed at all and where the police control everything, such as Syria. Large crowds were allowed to burn down the Danish embassy without any apparent police intervention. The thing had every appearance of a horrible orchestration. I thought, well, here again, what could be a clearer case? Here is a small Scandinavian democracy which had a fairly heroic record of resistance to Nazism. Its citizens are peaceful. Its government is not allowed by law to censor the press. The demand was that the government close that paper and apologize for its publication. The Danish Prime Minister said, I can't do that. I have no right in law to affect the publication of cartoons or articles in Denmark. But at least the Friends of Denmark will show their faces now, and we'll have a proper discussion about this full frontal challenge to the values of the First Amendment. Can't wait to see, for example, what the State Department will say. The Bush State Department, here's a chance for it to really stick out its chest and testify for real values. Well, the Bush State Department made a statement saying, we're very sorry about any offense caused by the Danish cartoons. Now, we don't keep a State Department going to comment on the internal affairs of Danish journalism. The State Department could reasonably have said that wasn't its job. Its job is to say, we stand by our democratic allies, and we particularly feel appalled at the violation of its diplomatic immunity and the sovereign protection of its diplomat. Couldn't even go that far. The first thing was to apologize. Well, that's bad, but I'm not a diplomat. I live in Washington, but I'm not a politician. I'm a journalist. I thought, well, my profession, my great profession, will stick up on this point, and we'll have a proper discussion. And the first thing is to show the cartoons, because people must see what the fuss is about. I mean, if we don't live now in the age of the image, where do we live? Everything is image-driven, newspapers, magazines, and of course the television. Everything is to do with the pictures themselves, the ipsissima. Not one outlet in the United States would publish or show those cartoons. Not one network, not one national newspaper, not one news magazine. I couldn't even get them on in my column in Slate, which is online, though you could in the end go by link to find them, but the magazine itself wouldn't take responsibility to do it. A small magazine I worked for, Skeptical, it's called the Skeptical Inquirer, secular magazine. It's not called Skeptical Magazine, it's called Free Inquiry. Pardon me, there are two I work for. Free Inquiry did publish them. I don't know if our circulation is even in 5 figures, but the bookstore chains immediately pulled all copies of our magazine from the shelves. And this was in response to no threat. It was in response to no pressure. It was in response to no danger at all. It's what, when I was a kid, we would say was crying before you were hurt. But I thought then, and I think now, it was a terrible capitulation. There wasn't anyone in the United States who would say, look, first order of business, let's see what the fuss is about. What do these pictures really look like? No one would take that responsibility. And nobody said it was for any other reason than fear. I know these people. I know these editors. I work for some of them. Why didn't you do it? What were you afraid of? We were afraid of reprisal. Well, of what value is your First Amendment? Of what value is the enormous money that you make out of free expression? The giant revenues that are to be made in a country that enjoys the right of free publication, if it won't be defended at the very first challenge. You think it can't get worse? Yes, it can. Yale University Press, which is run by someone who used to be a publisher of mine but won't ever be again, called John Donachich, decides to commission a book by a Danish scholar on the Danish cartoons, a learned subject, a learned treatment of the subject, including the vexed question of, is there permissible representation of the Prophet Muhammad in Islamic art? Nicely produced book comes out, Yale University Press, the University of Nathan Hale, the man who said, give me liberty or give me death. And then at the last minute they decide to cut out all the illustrations in the book, all of them, not just the cartoons, no illustration of any kind. Yale University Press, without a shot being fired, says, no, we're not going to do it. We don't have the guts for it. They even issued a statement saying that they felt if they did do so, they would be instigating violence. Now, another thing that depressed me at that point, separate question, is it's a pity that at the University Press of a great university, the proofreaders don't know the meaning of the word instigate. To instigate something is to try and make it happen. It's equivalent to saying incitement. It's saying you're trying to stir something up. It is your aim that there be violence if you instigate it. In the passive use of the word, they made themselves responsible for any action taken of a criminal nature, criminally violent nature, by the publication of the book, which has two bad effects. One, it runs away and it deprives the readers, as well as the author of the book, of the right to discuss the matter freely. And second, in advance it excuses the criminal activity because, after all, it can't be their fault. It's ours for showing the pictures. It's ours for printing the book. It's ours for having Salman as an author in our midst. It's our fault. And so there's an indemnity given in advance to the men of violence. That's therefore a double insult, if you like, to the principles of civilization. And it goes on. You'll probably remember on New Year's Eve, we were preoccupied at that point by the so-called Christmas bomber who nearly brought down a full civilian aircraft from Amsterdam over the city of Detroit. But a few nights later, on New Year's Eve, one of the authors of one of those cartoons, a man called Kurt Westergaard, a 79-year-old man, who was having a sleepover with his granddaughter in Copenhagen, one of the quietest, calmest, sweetest towns you can ever hope to see, has his door broken in with an axe by a wanted Somali gangster who's come to kill him and his granddaughter with an axe on New Year's Eve. And if he hadn't managed to lock himself in the bathroom and press a panic button, they'd both be dead. And Mr. Westergaard, you'll be interested to hear, has since been let go by his magazine as someone who it's too much trouble to keep on the staff. It's just happened a couple of weeks ago. It's all very well to stick up for free speech, but there are limits. And you can't have someone embarrassing you by having his granddaughter and himself attacked on New Year's Eve. It gets around, you look bad. You think it couldn't happen here? Well, I've already told you it could, and has with the cartoon case. And then, I hope it won't have escaped your attention that last week, the channel on American television that above all prides itself on saying that the answer to the question, is nothing sacred, is always no. Where there is no cow that cannot be smacked around and abused, Comedy Central decided that discretion was by far the better part of valor, and of all things to cave in on, and of all the examples we could set to the smart and wised up American youth who like to watch it, South Park is told you can't make a teddy bear joke involving the Prophet Muhammad. And so Irreverence Central, No Holds Barred Central, gives in without a fight, or let's say not without a fight. Let's give them some credit. There is one nutcase who has one website in New York who posted a picture on his website of what happened to Theo van Gogh, the Dutch filmmaker, who made a film about the oppression of Muslim women in the city of Amsterdam, and who was ritually murdered in the street, having been shot off his bicycle. He was gutted like a sheep in the roadway, and a knife plunged into his heart, which held attached to it a letter, an open letter, to another good friend of mine, Miss Ayaan Hirsi Ali, whose wonderful new book, Nomad, is about to be published, telling her, as an elected member of the Dutch Parliament and a refugee from Somalia and from genital mutilation and from forced marriage and from sectarian warfare and religious theocratic oppression, that she was next. And she now lives in this country, and I can't even tell you where anymore, because she too, like so many of my friends now in Europe and the United States, has to go around with a permanent bodyguard. Whereas the people who put Theo van Gogh's picture on their website and say to the makers of Comedy Central, this is going to happen to you, signed revolutionmuslim.com, don't appear to feel any kind of fear at all. They seem to feel, as perhaps they are, that the First Amendment protects them too. Well, if it does, and if this great architecture of free speech, if this constitutional roof under which we've all been thriving so proudly for so long is to mean anything, then we're going to have to say revolution.com cannot close down an American cable channel at whim by making a little bit of a threat. So the question comes right back to where I suppose I initiated it, which is, it's no longer a hypothetical one. You're not being asked, what would you do when the climate of fear began to spread, and when even people you thought to be reliable and brave will remember urgent appointments elsewhere, and say, well, perhaps this particular meeting I could skip, or maybe that petition isn't so vitally important. After all, I've signed so many petitions in my time, I can miss one. And anyway, Captain Alfred Dreyfus always looked a bit of a seedy character to me, rather suspicious-looking type. You know, maybe we should pick our fights with more care. You can feel the air, the atmosphere thickening with excuses and with euphemisms. No, the question is, what are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about it? Now, if what I was just told is true, the ranks of this very hall this evening were thinned, not by the prospect of having myself instead of Sherman Alexie, forbidding enough as it is, but by a fizzled nothing of a bomb in Times Square. Look, you are the children of a revolution. The United States did have to go through a great deal to erect this architecture of constitutional freedom and protection. People in living memory died to register to vote, to be able to hold a public meeting, to be able to assert their most basic and elementary rights. And we celebrate them every year, and we all wish we could have been there, and we weren't. But we can be, because there'll always be a time, a rendezvous with this question, and everyone's going to measure themselves, as Arthur Miller did, by how they shape up to it. So I can now, if I haven't made my point by now, I'm not going to have made it, am I? And I think I've probably about trespassed on the point where Salman and I were going to talk, and then you can be our prisoners for a bit longer, and then we'll be your hostage. And so this would be the moment perhaps to invite back on the stage someone who has witnessed for this. I've talked a lot about it, but Salman's done a lot of it too. Here you are, old horse.
Yeah.
Over to you.
All right, well.
Yes. Away with Abe.
Yes, yes to me. Thanks, Christopher. I wanted to just, I'm just going to, in some random way, respond to a few of the things you said, and then we can, let's talk about the cartoons a bit more, because it seems to me that there's two separate issues about things like the Danish cartoons which get conflated. One is the question about should the cartoons have been published in the first place? Now, it seems to me any newspaper editor, anybody on a picture desk of a newspaper or a magazine, every day is presented with material where they have to make the decision, is this worth putting in the magazine or not? And I think we can also agree that maybe no two picture editors would make the same decisions. Some of them would print all those things, some of them would print one or two, some of them would print none of them. So on the one hand, you've got the argument about quality and so on, should the things be in the paper? Yes. I mean, myself, I think that most of them were rather tedious, and the ones that weren't were actually the most offensive ones. I mean, the best cartoon was the one which shows suicide bombers arriving at the pearly gates. Yes. To be greeted by the Prophet Muhammad saying, would you please stop doing it because we're running out of virgins? Yes. Now, that has the great merit of being funny.
That has a bit of bite to it.
Yeah. And actually, the one with the turban, the bomb in the turban, was similarly, you know, a perfectly legitimate, strong, satirical point.
And well drawn. Too.
And well drawn. You know, and so those two, the ones that people got most exercised about, would actually be the ones that I would, if I was a picture editor, that I would have published, and many of the others were just beyond bland. So that's one issue. Would you do it, would you not do it? But it seems to me then there's the second issue, which is what you were talking about, I think, is what happens when the subject of violence arises. And at that point, it seems to me the subject changes. The subject is no longer about whether you should publish or not publish these things, but about how do you respond to violence.
Yes.
Do you respond to it with cowardice or courage? And at that point, it seems to me that every newspaper in the world should publish the Danish cartoons. Not because they like them, and not actually because they particularly want to insult Islam, but just to make the point that you don't give in to threats.
Yes.
You know? And so I think sometimes, you know, when people start talking about the cartoons as objects, you know, were they good or bad, were they offensive or inoffensive, that's one half of the point. But the second half of the point is the question of the response to violence. You know, and I think that's one of the things that has got very blurred recently.
Well, should I comment?
Yeah.
Well, first, you know what happens to Muhammad Atta when he blows himself up and arrives at the pearly gates? You don't know? He was told, okay, welcome. Let's see, who don't you know? Here's Mr. Thomas Jefferson. Here's Mr. James Madison. Shakes his hand. Have you met Mr. George Mason? Shakes his hand. Mr. Patrick Henry. Okay, Patrick Henry, what is this? He said, well, you did ask for 72 Virginians.
There's even a better thing.
I was afraid this might happen.
This is, I'm now not kidding, serious Islamic scholarship has recently suggested that the 72 virgins was a mistranslation of the original, and then what was actually supposed to greet people on their arrival as martyrs was 72 raisins.
Yeah. Raisins or white grapes. You know, there's a Syro-Aramaic mistranslation of the Quran that appears to have done a lot of damage.
I think one of the few good reasons for believing in the afterlife is wanting to see the faces of you know, Muhammad Atta and company arriving in heaven to be handed a bowl of raisins.
Yeah. It also adds to the strong case for saying that holy books are in fact man-made and not dictated by God, which is, I think, a good part of this discussion. Look, remember, the origin of the Danish question was this. It was proposed in Denmark, which was doing its level best, as many societies have, to make Muslims feel welcome in Danish society. It was thought the world's school children should learn about Islam. We should have a book for kids, a cartoon book, you know, all you need to know, Islam for beginners kind of thing. But they couldn't get any cartoonists, children's cartoonists, to do it because they were afraid of making a mistake.
Yes.
of upsetting someone. So it was to satirize this reticence and this fear that Fleming Rose, my friend, the editor of G-Line's Post, and said, all right, let's have a cartoonist competition and we'll see if we can represent the prophet. So it begins with this reticence. The second thing is, you're right, of course, that people should do it out of solidarity. And you're right, of course, that it's a judgment call in point of taste in the first instance. But once it's become a matter of violence and controversy, there's a second stage, which is you have to report it.
Yes, you do.
Which everybody did on the front page, except they reported it without the content.
Yeah.
Let's do it without the picture. I can't really think of a parallel of what, I mean, they would say, well, Picasso's gone too far with Guernica. You know, he's taken an obviously propagandistic attitude towards the Spanish Civil War. There's a huge row about this painting. You'd be very interested to know more about it, but unfortunately we can't show you what it looks like, because that would be inviting reprisal from Franco or something. I can't think of a but even worse now was everything is image. Everything is imagery.
One of the most, I think, mealy-mouthed pieces of language that is developed to justify this kind of behavior is a kind of reinvention of the meaning of the word respect. It seemed to me, when I was growing up, that respect meant that you took people seriously. It didn't mean that you never disagreed with them. You know, to respect someone is to say, okay, we'll take on what you have to say, and if I don't agree with it, I will offer a counter-argument. The idea that it would be disrespectful to someone to in any way disagree from their system of belief is a new idea, is a new meaning of the term respect, and it seems to me to have nothing to do with respect. And what it actually means is I'm too afraid to do it. So what you have is cowardice masquerading as respect, and that's become more and more and more common, very clear in the case of the cartoons. Because I think the point you made, which needs to be said a great deal, is that blasphemy, the refusal to accept the church as the limiting point on thought, is something which throughout human history has been the thing that has moved the human race forward. I mean, you mentioned Galileo and Socrates. And one should also remind people that the trial of Jesus Christ was a blasphemy trial.
Sure was.
You know, so, and from those three, you could say you have, you know, Western religious belief, Western scientific understanding, and Western philosophy. They all emerge from blasphemy cases.
Yeah, and he was asking for trouble by saying he was the Son of God.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
He knew what he was doing, as they used to say meaningfully, don't you?
I remember that. I always was amused, or not amused, it wasn't funny at the time, when people said that about me that I knew what I was doing. It would be really strange, I thought, to spend 5 years writing a novel and not know what you were doing. Yeah. What would that be, that act?
But then another thought, though, which I meant to intrude earlier, you were raised a Muslim.
Yeah, well,
so you can be accused of apostasy.
I know, except my parents were about as Muslim as a chewed-off fingernail. You know, I've always thought that the great gift my parents gave me was to not be religious. They sort of excused me religion.
No, well, that's true, but in the eyes of the
I know, yes,
of the Ummah, you belong. Like, just as that's why people say lapsed Catholic. You can't leave the church unless you're excommunicated.
No, if I'd been called
you
Harvey
can't.
Weinstein, there would have been no fatwa.
Well, there wouldn't have been.
I mean, maybe there should have been. That's another question.
Yes, actually, that's a very tempting. No, never mind. That's not good.
I mean,
but with you and Ayan Hirsi Ali and with Taslima Nasreen and many others, there's the question of apostasy, which Muslims can, if they like, claim as their internal affair. What's interesting now with Denmark is a new line, and Comedy Central, and a couple of other events in London, is that the line's being crossed now. You don't have to be a Muslim to be brought within the range of reprisal.
I remember quite soon after the attack on the Standing Verses being sent by a fan a T-shirt on which was the legend, "Blasphemy is a victimless crime." Which, you have to think about it. Mm-hmm. And then you realize that it's completely in line with your, with God is not great, because of course it's God who is the victim who doesn't exist.
Yes, Salman rather woundingly said of my title that it was annoyingly one word too long. Just circumcise one word and you've got the truth.
I wanted to ask you a couple of things now. I mean, I think, yes, we should come back to this a bit, but it seemed to me one of the things that to people of our generation is very strange, I think, is the recrudescence of religion as a political force. Because when we were kids in the 60s, there were many things that were up there that we needed to fight against. I don't think it ever occurred to us that the power of religion, whatever religion, would once again be the thing we had to battle. We actually thought that that battle was won. And it turns out that we were wrong. And I wanted to ask you why you think that is. What is it? You know, one of the things that André Malraux is supposed to have said, and apparently did not say, is that the 21st century will be the century of religion. Apparently he didn't say that. But it seems so far, on the basis of 10 years, to be the case. And I wonder why you think it is that this battle that we all thought was over has returned to become the central battle of our time.
Well, Lenin apparently really did say that he thought the last battle would be between communism and Islam, partly because Islam was a competitor in the Third World against imperialism, which in some ways it can still represent itself as being. So I think that a approximate cause, not an exact one, but an approximate cause would be a contributing cause, probably is the collapse of communism. Not least in the Soviet Union itself, or rather in former Soviet territory itself, where now, for example, the Russian Orthodox Church, the old patron of serfdom and Tsarism and anti-Semitism, is now fully back in a very dangerous nationalist form. It's the clerical bodyguard to Putin's regime. It has special privileges within the state, the army and elsewhere, and over all other faiths in Russia. That's by the way, I think it'll be a very dangerous thing as Russian chauvinism and revanchism gets more increased. We have a tremendous revival of the forces of reaction in the Roman Catholic Church, exemplified by this very squalid Bavarian bureaucrat who's the current Pope, whose first act as Pope was to readmit to the Church those who'd been excommunicated for denying the Holocaust and so on, to rebuild the hard right-wing element of Catholicism that basically thought Vatican II was a mistake. So re-fundamentalizing what they still think of as the one true church. Then you have the crazy settlers in occupied territories in Palestine who think that they can bring on the Messiah by stealing Arab land. And then you have the Christians who say, wouldn't that be a great idea? We support the Jews as the rope supports the hanging man. They bring on the apocalypse, we get Jesus back. A lot of whom are in this country and trying still to maintain, this goes on too, I wouldn't have believed it, that American children should be taught garbage with equal time. No. Now girls and boys, after the chemistry practice, will have alchemy break.
I remember.
It's enough to make a cat laugh, isn't it? But they never stop in Texas and also big school book producing areas. That this nonsense is unstoppable.
Now, I remember at the time that the state of Kansas decided that intelligent design had to be taught at the same level as that straight, vaguely unproved theory called Darwinism. It actually, I wrote a piece in which I suggested that this decision by the state of Kansas showed that Darwin was wrong, because it showed that natural selection did not always choose the fittest to survive. And sometimes the unfittest survived, and that it was actually possible for the human race to regress as well as progress. So there was a wonderful, in Alabama, I remember, there was a public servant who said that we couldn't be sure about the truth of the theory about the Big Bang because nobody was there at the time.
Yes. Yes. But the equal time demand, I think, is an excellent one, because there are now a very large number of churches who take this view, who are in support, in receipt of grants from the so-called faith-based initiative, which I'm sorry to say President Obama hasn't cancelled, or otherwise in receipt of a tax break. And so it seems to me very clear we should take them up on equal time, say we'll teach your stuff in the schools at least once a week, not in the science class, but in the social studies bit, and you have to sell and teach Darwin material 50% of the time in your church.
But, you know, just to press you...
And that'll be the law, and see how they like a little of that.
It seems to me, even if you just look at the United States, if you look at the politics of the post-war period, if you look at the Eisenhower election, even the Kennedy election, so that it wasn't so necessary for religion to be a subject in the election. Nowadays, it seems to me you can't be elected dog catcher in America unless you talk about your deep belief in such and such church. Why do you think it is that there's so much greater power of religious discourse in this country?
I actually think that that's only true if you and everyone else keeps saying so. I mean, the number of people who check none of the above for religion in the country has doubled in the last year. Or sorry, the last 5 years, to something like 16, 17%. I think it's probably higher. The number of people who check the box and say, I am a Baptist or I am a Catholic, I know because I go and debate in their churches full of crisis and uncertainty. It doesn't reflect a monolithic religiosity at all. Barack Obama got elected while having to disown the only church he'd ever been near. He'd taken so little care to pick one that it nearly got him unelected, the church he went to. Since hasn't been to a church at all, and ended his inauguration speech, which I attended, with a very good quotation from Thomas Paine. So I'm not sure at all. I think if a person of reasonable integrity and honesty and presentability, let's say, was able to face the electorate and say, I personally don't attend a church and don't have a belief, I think there's every reason to think they could win.
Well, I hope you're right. The political right in this country clearly thinks that the religious card is well worth playing.
Yes, but the Christian right have had a very thin time lately, and the Catholic right as well. I mean, who really now thinks that the Catholic Church has any moral right to tell a politician that they'll be denied the sacraments if they don't conform? I mean, I'd like to see them try it again. I really do. Would like to see that.
Well,
that would once have been a very dreadful threat.
To move it outside this country, let me just ask you, given the Huntington thesis, all these ideas about clash of civilizations, what do you think? Do you think these are wars of religion, or are they wars, as many wars of religion have done, wars which use religion as a cloak for other discontents?
Well, I'm sure it's both, but a lot of the latter. I mean, remember that the Crusades, which the Muslim world goes on about a lot, and quite understandably, began with a huge pogrom against European Jewry. Then when they more or less finished that, nearly finished it, they moved across the Bosphorus, or not across, but to the Bosphorus, and destroyed Byzantine Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which they thought of as a heresy and an anathema. So before they even got to Jerusalem and started butchering the Muslims, they'd settled accounts with the Jews and with the only other papacy, the only other Christian rival, excuse me, in the picture. So I think Sir Stephen Runciman is probably quite right to say that at that point, the Crusades were the most retarding experience that human civilization had ever undergone, and we're still suffering from the consequences. It was an intra-Christian war that led to the Crusades. Likewise, as you can see in Iraq and elsewhere, there's at least one civil war within Islam, between the Sunni and the Shia, against Ahmadi Muslims, for example, who are considered heretical, especially in Pakistan, against Sufism. It's becoming a warlord religion almost, Islam, because there are dueling fatwas issued by separate authorities, unluckily for them in some ways and for us. They don't have a pope who can put a unified line everyone has to follow. There are various centers of power. And often they want to settle these disputes on non-Muslim soil. I mean, after all, no Sunni government ever supported the fatwa against you, I think.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. Well, I mean, it was no government at all, actually, other than that of Iran. And that was partly for political reasons, because actually, when the protests against the Satanic Verses began, they were largely financed by Saudi Arabia. And the Iranian fatwa actually hijacked a Saudi campaign, thus enormously pissing off Saudi Arabia. And it's one of the reasons...
No one outbids the Ayatollah.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, I just would like to point out in regard to me and the Ayatollah Khomeini that, one of us is dead.
Yes.
Do not mess with novelists.
Yes. Litera scripta manet, the written word will remain.
And it's true that if you look at the Muslim world, the political, apart from the Sunni-Shia split, the political dissensions are so profound that it's very difficult to speak of a jihad.
Yes.
That, I mean, the Afghans hate the Iranians, who hate the Saudis, who hate the Syrians, so on. So it's clearly not unified. But on the other hand, there clearly has grown up something which is of appeal to, it may be a small group, but a dangerous group, where the idea of the pan-global jihad has become very attractive.
Yes.
And what do you think that's about?
I mean, it's very noticeable, for example, I shouldn't prejudge their case, but I don't like the look of it. The 4 Pakistani boys who left a suburb of my hometown the other day and turned up in the wrong camp in Pakistan are only the latest in a large number of young men from England, from France, elsewhere, who've volunteered to go die in remote parts of the Muslim world. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? It always has to be they want to go work with Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. Why wouldn't a young Muslim in London before 2001 have wanted to go and fight with the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan, which was as Muslim an organization as could be, had fought against the Soviet Union, was opposed to the Taliban, had probably had more support than it did. No one goes to volunteer for that. No one went to volunteer for the Kurdish people who were fighting against Saddam Hussein, just as Muslim. All the Muslim activists took the side of Saddam Hussein when it came to the crunch in the war, who himself enjoyed the support of Al-Qaeda. If not in a military operational sense, he had the sympathy of their proclamations. In some horrible way, it's thought that you're an Uncle Tom if you're any other kind of Muslim.
Yes.
That the authentic stuff has to be the most horrible, the most extreme, and the most completely consecrated to violence, that consecration being sealed by self-destruction, suicide. So that it really is a battle for what you could call the soul of Islam.
I sometimes think, I wondered what you think about this, that in the way that Soviet communism, Soviet-style communism, kind of burned through a large part of the world and then burned out, there's an argument which says that in those countries where radical Islam has become most powerful, it is also most disliked. That's to say, the people of Afghanistan, a very large majority of them do not like the Taliban. A very large majority of the population of Iran does not like the rule of the Ayatollahs. Sure. The people of Algeria who flirted with the fiefs of the GIA very rapidly moved away from them. So
Iraq? Iraq has totally isolated the Al-Qaeda.
So here's an argument, which is that here's a rhetoric which appears to be very attractive, kind of sexy, glamorous, particularly to young men without much hope of a future. And it can burn into a society with great speed, but then very rapidly people come to discover that they hate it. Yes. So what do you think of that idea that this may be a short-lived phenomenon?
By the way, I think you're obviously right. I mean, there's every sign of a turn of that kind among the people of Somalia now, as well against the so-called Shabab, many of whom are foreign volunteers, quite a lot of them Americans. And yes, no one who's ever tried it once wants to try it again. That's absolutely true. But it's a lot to go through. And it can Afghanistan will take a long, long time to recover. Yes. Just from a fairly brief period of Taliban rule. It's not very difficult to diagnose either. I mean, after all, if you forbid yourself the talents of 50% of the population to start with, just before you do anything else, then you ban music, then you ban all books that aren't the Quran, the floor is going to keep on dropping. It takes a long time to bring it back up to where it was. So, if you mean, might we just let them burn themselves out? I don't think you were saying anything as callous as that, but if you think, well, could we sit it out in some, I mean, I sometimes think perhaps not, because the damage done is so great, and the problem with it, as with all theocracies, is it doesn't have a self-critical capacity. If they look around and they notice, okay, all the children's teeth are falling out, nothing works here except the secret police. In the fields, nothing really grows except footprints. What have we been doing wrong? What they'll say is, we haven't been doing anything wrong. We just maybe haven't been praying hard enough. And in the meantime, the Crusader Zionist conspiracy has been at work to subvert our country.
Yeah.
So of the huge number of failed and unemployed and unemployable young men they've got, they try to export them. They export the violence back to the West, so that we have every interest in not just stopping the jihadist element, but in stopping the terrible underdevelopment that Islamism brings. I mean, just to say it this way, very often you read people, quite smart people, saying, well, these people are the product of poverty and unemployment. So you've heard it. No, they're not. They're the cause of poverty and unemployment. No society they've ever had any control over has not been immediately more poor and with much less employment. The national income of Indonesia was reduced by a whole point by the attacks of Al-Qaeda on Bali, for example. They drove many people into poverty and unemployment. That's their plan. But don't fool yourself that it's a protest against bad conditions. It's a wish for them.
At the height of the Soviet Union, a lot of non-Soviet socialist voices in Europe and America, around the world, made a distinction between what they saw as the distortions of the Soviet system and what they called actually existing communism, which was clearly cruel and despotic and so on and so on, and if you like, true socialism.
Yes.
The true church of Karl Marx, which was virtuous. It seems to me now that there's often a similar argument being made. People who wish to distinguish themselves from actually existing Islam, which is cruel and despotic in many of its national manifestations, and the separate idea of the true faith, which is religion of peace and love. And I wondered what you thought about that.
Well, I was one of those on the left who spent a lot of time with the left opposition in Eastern Europe, people who did take a form of that critique, who were not in favor of NATO or capitalism. People like, I suppose in Poland, Adam Michnik would have been one. Not Havel, but some of the Czech opposition were democratic socialists of one kind or another. Yeah, and in Yugoslavia too, and in Bosnia particularly. So, and I still have some sympathy for that critique. The thing about that is it's a bit more testable objectively. I mean, if you come to the conclusion, actually there is something wrong with the pricing policy of a socialist economy, it has, of all things, real difficulty working out what the value of things ought to be. And this probably isn't a result of it being hijacked. It may be a fault. Ab initio. You don't think you're going to go to hell for saying that, say, or you don't bring upon yourself quite the same condemnation. The thing about theocracy is that it tends to say that if anything goes wrong, if the system breaks down, it is only because we haven't tried it hard enough. Yeah. Thus, for example, I go on about this all the time. We should be thinking about our Iranian brothers and sisters every day, not just the struggle they're having to bring about a democracy, and the fact that the Revolutionary Guards who've taken over their country are also the people who control the nuclear weapons, but that on top of that, Iran is booked to have a terrible seismic catastrophe. It's coming like a heart attack to Tehran. And no one's doing anything to earthquake-proof the country at all, nothing. Nothing like what the Chileans have done even. It's more like Haiti. And at Friday prayers, I knew this would happen. Friday prayers, I've been writing about it for weeks. At Friday prayers the week before last, the guy did discuss the possibility of the earthquake coming, being quite bad news, which, by the way, it will be if there are underground nuclear facilities that no one knows about. And he said, well, of course there'll be an earthquake because women insist on uncovering their faces.
Yes, the promiscuity of women.
This was the official sermon of Friday in Tehran.
The sexuality of women was the cause of the earthquakes.
Now, both of us have suffered from the seismic. Both of us have suffered from the seismic effects of the female sex.
Speak for yourself.
And we know it can't be. We know it can't be underestimated. It can move mountains, all right. But this is ridiculous. But they know they have to have an explanation, and well, I don't think even Stalinoid Marxism ever quite crapped out to that degree. Yeah.
It's a new low.
That's right.
Look, before I want to open it up to the audience, but just before we do, I want to ask you one question on a different subject, which is something like the subject that Sherman Alexie might have been addressing, which is to do with the future of journalism in the new age we find ourselves. And clearly, you've said most of your life as a working journalist, and we live in a moment when the environment is being transformed. And
yes.
I had dinner about a year ago in Washington. I was seated next to the publisher of the Washington Post, Catherine Weymouth, and I asked her, because there were many stories about the Washington Post being in difficulties. Now, the worry, of course, for many of us is that the internet has not yet shown itself to be capable of supporting a news-gathering, investigative project of the kind that great newspapers have supported.
Yes.
So if the print media die and the internet fails immediately to replace them, what are the prospects, if you like, for the truth?
Yes, well, one reason why I nearly couldn't make your kind invitation this evening was that last night we had to give the party at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, the annual thing where the press fawns too much on the president and the president fawns slightly too much on the press, and there we all were in the Washington Hilton ballroom, and I thought, you know, it looks thinner every year somehow. And I could add to what, and Catherine was there. She came to our right after that. I was thinking, the Washington Times, which is the only rival to the Washington Post in Washington now, and which is a paper owned by the Reverend Sung Myung Moon of the Unification Church, of that, is very nearly dead. And we'll be a one newspaper town pretty soon. I think last year, Seattle became a one newspaper town. I was astounded by that, I have to say. St. Louis, I think. 3 or 4. Los Angeles has been one for a bit, and the LA Times has gone down faster and further than anyone would have believed. Well, everyone knows a bit of this story, I suppose, but it's the speed of it that impresses me. And that's at the production end, if you like. At the demand end, I teach writing, and I've sometimes teach journalism. And of my students, I would say that none now regularly take a newspaper. And that's more or less it. The demographic, as we say, that's a death sentence. If the habit of picking up a paper and carrying it around with you or taking it into the house in the morning is gone among the young, then you've more or less set the clock.
But what are the consequences of that?
Well, so I used to think, well, the positive thing is that now, if I have a bright young student whose work is promising, I don't have to limit myself to saying to them, look, I can probably introduce you to someone in the newsroom in Chicago or New York, wherever it might be. Probably get your clips read. You might be able to bypass having to join the newspaper guild or a union or anything like this, so that you might get a break. I can say to them, look, you could put up your own site. You could publish. If you're doomed to write, you're doomed to write. And you could say, okay, I'll put it up there and see if anyone wants to come. Expose yourself directly to the thing. And that's been quite encouraging. And I know some people who've done rather well out of it. But here's what I think is the danger. It's partly the one you identify. It opens us to an era of so terrible relativism, where everyone's opinion is as good as anyone else's. You don't have to earn any credibility in a way. And pretty soon you'd have not just your own opinions, but your own choice of facts, and there wouldn't be a common stock of reference, which is, by the way, also a problem in teaching literature these days. Very difficult to find a book that everyone has read.
But do you think that the things like the iPad and the Kindle are ways for newspapers to survive?
Yes, I mean, I think they're the only way they can survive. But it won't postpone. It won't postpone. I don't think people who weren't buying the New York Times weren't buying it because they couldn't get it on Kindle, or will now read it because they can get it that way. And there's actually an easy proof of that, I think. I was in, I hate taxi TV, don't you?
Yes.
But one particularly abject thing that happened to me the other day in New York was, it was a New York Times ad, clearly pitched to the youth market in that fawning way that older marketers talk to young people, or the people they imagine to be young, and say, just get the weekend edition. You don't have to sweat through all the news and news. It's all about sports and games and music and theater and the movies. You love it. Yeah. And the Washington Times, the Washington Catherine's advertising on the radio in Washington is exactly the same. Just take it for a couple of days a week and read the fun stuff. Yeah. Don't think of us as a fuddy-duddy news gathering. We're not going to bore you with lots of stories about you know, Afghanistan or crap like that. Downers.
Everything is
Yeah.
entertainment.
So the defeat has already been experienced, if you like. It's a shame. I was telling someone before about, has anyone seen The Paper with Michael Keaton?
Phil.
Great, and Marisa Tomei? Great, a great movie, I think, about a day in the life of a hack tabloid journalist in New York. He's obviously working for the Post, but the 3 papers are on his table in the morning, and his paper headline says, you know, headless body and topless bar, and the Daily News says something like, you know, Ford to New York dropped dead, and the New York Times says signs of swing to moderation in Nepalese elections. And he throws the paper to the floor and says, these bastards will do anything to sell newspapers. Well, that's over, believe me.
Well, on that point, we have about 15 minutes or so. So if people have questions they'd like to ask Christopher, there's 2 microphones there and there, and if you could...
Or you, sir.
Well, or me, but really him. If you could go to the microphones and take it in turn, yeah, that's good.
I love free speech, but I'm worried about Fox News. Their influence, they have so many viewers and they lie so much. Is Jon Stewart enough? You know, and Colbert, how do we deal with them? They just make all the noise in the world.
Yeah, I sometimes feel that I'm not as judgmental about Fox as I might be, but it's because I was brought up for a large part of the early part of my life in London, where there's no pretense of objectivity in journalism. Where you know what you're getting. You look at the newsstands and they're ablaze with different papers that are party-oriented, that are run in the interests of certain proprietors, not least among them Keith Rupert Murdoch, who I last saw at 3 o'clock this morning by the French Embassy swimming pool, with a wife half his age. Yeah. Looking by the way, as if he's got a lot of good years left in him. So I don't get shocked so easily. What I don't like is a paper or an outlet that pretends to be objective and is not. I think that's much more of a danger.
Yes. I'd like to ask both of you what you think about, there's been a relatively recent court case about the Pledge of Allegiance in which the plaintiff was arguing that it's a semi-prayer, you know, especially the part where it says under God, and trying to discourage and trying to make it, you know, illegal to force kids or encourage kids to say that during school. I wondered what you thought about that.
Well, I know the case very well, and I think Mr. Newdow, who brought it, is actually a slight pain in the ass. Because instead of saying what he should have said, which is that the Pledge of Allegiance was written and promulgated and became popular and well-loved right across America in the 1880s, written by a socialist who was trying to bring American society back together after the Civil War, and was trying to think of a pledge that anyone in the country could recite, whatever their background. It went on like that. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with justice, liberty and justice for all. It's beautiful. In the McCarthy years, the time of the toad, as Arthur Miller and Lillian Hellman used to call it, it was objected by some big mouth at a Flag Day ceremony at a cleric, where Eisenhower was president and was also president, said, this pledge could be recited by a child in Moscow, word for word. So how could you make it so it couldn't be? New problem. How could we have a pledge that couldn't be recited in Moscow? Shove in 2 words where they don't belong, destroy the rhythm of the thing, and make it religious, put in under God. So what you want to say is, no, I'm for original intent. I'm a strict constructionist. I want the pledge back the way it was. Most people are under the impression that it always had those words in, and the atheists are coming to take it out. This is stupid. But of course, it's flat out unconstitutional to ask a child to say under God. You may not do that. First Amendment is beautifully written. There's no wiggle room in it. Congress may make no law respecting an establishment of religion.
Thank you.
Great Britain is having an election this week, and one of the candidates who seems to be doing very well, Nick Clegg of the Liberal Democrats, is a professed atheist. If he does very well in that election, does that mean something changing in Britain, something new that we don't have in this country?
No, England is very different to the United States in this regard. When Tony Blair, who is deeply religious, was running for office, his main kind of flag catcher, Alistair Campbell, said openly afterwards that they deliberately played down his religious beliefs because it would lose them votes. Now, in England, to be religious is to be a flake. and who would vote for you if that's what you know, like I remember when George W. Bush was asked early in his presidency if he ever consulted his father now that he was president, and he said, pointing upwards, no, because he had another father to whom he would refer. Now, if he were to say that in a British general election, he would be run out of town on a rail.
Yes. I've always thought that actually what George Jr. was saying is, I'd rather talk to any father than that one. But young Mr. Clegg, as I think of him, used to be my intern at The Nation magazine. And of course I would have hired him if he was a Muslim, but I'm glad to know that he still isn't a believer in any holy book. And what Salman says is true. In fact, I could have answered the last gentleman's question by saying this. Maybe we should just force all Americans to have prayer in the schools, because I don't know a quicker way of bringing about the mass production of atheism among the young. And that certainly the reason for the secularization of British society is that religion is compulsory in English and Scottish and Welsh schools. It has to be a certain Christian Protestant kind, and the Queen is the head of the church as well as the state and the armed forces, which means that the moment her heart ceases to beat, it should never happen, but the moment that does happen, Prince Charles becomes the head of the Church of England, a bat-eared Muslim fancier with no taste in women. And that's what you get for founding a church on the family values of Henry VIII.
But I think, no, the truth is, I think that in England it's just not an issue that Nick Clegg is not religious.
No one would dream of bringing it up against him, no, and it would rebound on them if they did.
We'll see how well he actually does on the day. I mean, I don't know what you think, Christopher. I think you could argue that in the end people will swing back towards the traditional two parties, or that the anti-Labour sort of landslide has now gone so far that they're actually going to do even worse than the opinion poll suggested, and that actually we will have a two-party state, but the Labour Party will be the third party.
I think it's a three-party society encased uncomfortably within a two-party duopoly, and every now and then it comes out again. It did with Jeremy Thorpe, if you remember, at one point in the 70s, and I think a large part of the vote for Mr. Clegg is a call for proportional representation, which now has to be discussed seriously.
Well, we'll find out on Thursday.
Yes.
Yes.
No.
I was really sad to hear you say that when the Danes were trying to get a Muslim book for children, they didn't go to Muslims and ask, how do we do it? And that may have prevented the cartoons from happening, the cartoon contest. And the other thing is all the talk about religion. It's really the extremists, the fanatics. It's not the mainstream, anyone, I believe, that's causing any difficulties anywhere. And I'd like your opinion.
Well, the question, I mean, what you say sounds persuasive, and I don't know, by the way, that they didn't go to consult. They would have done, Muslim authorities, but the question would be, well, which ones would those be? Because there are quite a number of imams in Denmark, but the ones who started the row about the cartoons are very extreme, and I'll come to your use of that word in a second, and weren't going to, I think, allow any discussion of the subject that they did not themselves control. So if you went to one Muslim authority, all you'd be doing was inviting yourself into a schismatic row between different factions of Muslims, which would have been a very depressing way to introduce Danish school children to the subject. That's the first thing. The second thing is the word fundamentalist or extreme has the following difficulty for me. Either there is a word of God or there is not. In my opinion, there is not. But if someone says, no, you know what, I think God did speak at Sinai, or did speak at the baptism of the Jordan, or did intervene to dictate texts of the Prophet Muhammad, Why does that make you a fundamentalist? I mean, I think it's an extraordinary thing to believe. But if you say, no, I don't really believe that, what you are is not a fundamentalist. You're not religious. Fundamentalism says there is God's word, there is revelation, there has been revelation. Atheism is to say there hasn't. Belief is what? To split that difference, it can't be split.
Yeah, I think we might even be able to discover a slight difference between Christopher and me here. I mean,
Bring it on.
I mean, maybe it's more apparent than real, but I think my view is that if people are religious and gain from it satisfaction, nourishment, solace, whatever it is, my view is that's none of my business. When that comes into the public arena and people of religious belief try and force the values of that belief onto me or onto the society in which I live, then it's my business. And I have very strong views about whether or not religion should be allowed into that arena. But in the privacy of one's own home or one's own mind, if one gains comfort from a certain set of ideas, however cockeyed they might be, my view is that's not your business or mine.
I couldn't agree more, but it's not in the nature of especially monotheism to let that happen, because they're looking at you going to hell. They're not allowed to do that. They're supposed to redeem you. They're supposed to save you.
Yes, I'm not going to be.
They can't leave you alone. I keep saying to them, if I thought there was a personal God who took all the trouble to care about me and supervise my movements and have a tender attitude towards me in general, and even promised me that I would not croak, I guess I have no idea what it would be like to feel anything so fatuous, but I suppose it would make me happy. You know, why doesn't it make? It doesn't make them happy at all. The people who say they believe this, they can't be happy till I believe it too, and that's the cause of the constant cultural battle. So no, I don't want to. Why do I even know what they believe?
So a church which was not militant, you think, is not?
Not really. No, it wouldn't be the church. Well, Judaism doesn't proselytize, except among Jews. Much. It doesn't anymore.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't say the Messiah has already come. It has its advantages there too.
All right. Yes.
Hi, yeah, my question is about engagement and maybe the role for engagement. There's been a lot of discussion about free speech and advocating it and standing up for it, but I live and work in China, and often when artists or musicians, writers abroad protest China, it does make it harder for people working in the system. So I just want to see your thoughts on the balance between engagement and protest, I guess.
Well, you keep hearing, I suppose it must sometimes be true that if everyone kept quiet about a certain country or a certain state and didn't give its government the impression that foreigners were intervening and so on, that it might make life easier for the tamer sort of dissident. I mean, one is often told that. We're always told, for example, that Iranians don't welcome support for their efforts from outsiders because they can then be identified or even criminalized with. Well, that's all right, again, as long as the regime itself stays out of my life. But the Iranians won't do that. They won't let me think, oh, well, I don't care what happens in Iran. On the contrary, they say they want to export people to kill Salman, people to overthrow the democracy of Lebanon, people to blow up the Jewish community center in Buenos Aires. We know the names of the people who've been doing this in Tehran, and to have an off-the-record nuclear program. Well, I'm sorry, this is not their internal affair. And I don't know of a single human rights question, since you mentioned your domicile. Burma, Zimbabwe, Iran, well, just those three for now. You try and get anything done about those appalling, North Korea, these appalling, really appalling regimes, and you find that they're protected by a Chinese guarantee at the United Nations. And in Sudan, Darfur to Sudan, China wants to buy all their oil, it meantime gives them all their weapons. You cannot address major human rights drama in the world now without coming up against Chinese power on the wrong side. I'm sorry, this is not their internal affair.
I'd also add to that, if you look at the experience of PEN American Center, I'd say two things. Every time that PEN has supported a writer in difficulties or arrested, whatever, in whatever country, we have heard back from those writers that it was enormously valuable to them to know that their case was being seen by the rest of the world, and that they gained great strength and nourishment from the fact that their case was being highlighted. So certainly in the cases of those writers who have been on the front line, to them it has mattered a great deal that their case was given prominence. But there's another thing, which is if you look at these so-called awards that PEN gives every year to writers, which actually obviously those are writers in jail, so the award is a way of highlighting their plight. There is an enormously high percentage, which I think is somewhere around 90%, of those writers being released from jail within a 6-month period. And it is because
that's very encouraging.
Tyranny does not like publicity. You know, it is one of the curious weaknesses of tyrants that they want to be liked. And if you could show them that they are not liked and actually that the world thinks they're assholes because of what they're doing to that writer or those writers, it's sometimes easier for them to release those writers and stop getting that kind of bad publicity. And this has been our experience in country after country for many, many years. You know, so I would say about the publicity that on the one hand it gives strength to the good guys, and on the other hand it very often discomfits the bad guys so much that they actually change their behavior. Yes?
Yes, I was wondering if you could give specific examples of great literary novels that are now being censored in Muslim societies. I'm very sympathetic about Satanic Verses, Children of Jabalawi, God Dies by the Nile, and so forth. But is there anything right now, and if so, would it be Al-Azhar that's doing it? Is it Saudi Arabia? Is it Iran? And could you give the name of the book and the author?
Well, the most famous book that is Baudelairized in every single Muslim country is not published unexpurgated in a single Muslim country at this point is The 1001 Nights. The Arabian Nights, the Arabian Nights, the most famous book in the history of Arab literature, cannot be published uncensored in any Arab country. Why? Because it's full of naughty bits. You know, there's a lot of sex in the Arabian Nights, and oddly, there's very little religion. You know, God doesn't make many appearances in the Arabian Nights, but men and women having a great deal of sex make a lot of appearances. And so there it is. Only the most famous work in the history of the literature is the one being censored. Iran has to authorize the publication of novels by a board of censors every year. There have been years, I don't know if this is one of them, but there have been years recently when not a single novel has been approved for publication. So no novels have been published. No novels were deemed worthy of publication. So the censorship is at a very extreme level.
It's also, I think, partly an aspect of underdevelopment. You should look up the Arab Development Report, which was produced under the auspices of my friend Clovis Maqsood, who used to be the head of the Arab League, and a panel of other regional intellectuals and writers on the sheer dearth of literary material, not as a result merely of censorship, but of the failure to publish or translate. Greece translates more books out of other languages and into Greek every year than the whole Arab world does in its entire language. So it's a matter of the unavailability of things, it's cultural starvation rather than singling out of a book for censorship. The only book I know about that comes straight to my mind, because I've just written the introduction to its anniversary edition, is Animal Farm, which is banned in all Muslim countries. Not just because of the pigs, who after all, if you remember, don't come that well out of the book, yes, but because certainly in Iran, where I've been involved in an attempt to get a pirate edition going, possibly smuggled back into Persia, it's because it's about a revolution betrayed. It's much more political.
Okay, we're out of time, so if you could please ask a quick question, and Chris will give a really quick answer that we can.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, you mentioned Václav Havel earlier, who, as you know, was a playwright before he became the president. And I've often wondered what a government composed of writers would look like, and if art and politics necessarily has to be independent in a free society. So I was just wondering if you think that would necessarily be detrimental and what that would look like.
Salman for president. Mr. President, I have called him that when he was president of Japan. Plato thought it would be the worst possible idea. In the Republic, he says that really would be terrible. That'd be the worst kind of tyranny you could picture. And poetry should probably be banned. What examples do we have that could be in the least bit encouraging here? Some countries have done very well by making their writers into ambassadors. Yeah. George Seferis was a brilliant ambassador.
Carlos Fuentes.
Jorge Edwards was a great diplomat.
Gallego, well, we had a near miss with Mario Vargas Llosa.
Yes.
We had Václav Havel. I'm not applying for the job.
Havel was the best. And Georgi Conrad was offered the presidency of Hungary after the collapse of communism, but the author of Anti-Politics and various other wonderful books, but he said no. I think partly because he thought the first independent president of Hungary, president of independent Hungary, should not be a Jew. A rather arcane reservation, but perhaps a good one in the circumstances.
Okay, well...
No, I think people should be elected.
I think
should run for office.
I think on behalf of Penn, we have to offer a big vote of thanks to Christopher Hitchens.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
For so eloquently stepping into the breach, and I think it now falls to me to declare this festival closed. Thank you.